We're going to look at two overarching ideas here, and then we'll break it down into its lesser parts. So fiscal policy breaks down into one of two categories. We either have contractionary fiscal policy or we have expansionary. And it depends on the situation which one you should use. So when you have an inflationary gap, you want to decrease that aggregate demand back to full employment. That's going to be contractionary. Okay. The tools are the same, right? The tools don't move. So it's government spending and taxes. So it's what you do with it. We just call that policy contractionary, expansionary. So if inflationary gap, we would decrease government spending, increase taxes, or a combination of both in order to bring that aggregate demand back in line with that long run aggregate supply. So we're at full employment again. If we're in a recession, we use expansionary. We want to increase our government spending, decrease our taxes, or a combination of both in order to move that aggregate demand right where it needs to be back at full employment. Okay, so you're all going to see from now on, especially today, you'll see contractionary and expansionary, and they're just asking you how you would use these tools underneath, or would you use contractionary expansion, a contractionary policy if there was a recession, for example. So it's just the idea here. We're just looking at terms. So let's take a look at this problem here. Kind of refresh us, and we're going to get right back into where we left off with Friday, which was our spending multiplier. And what we're going to do is we're going to add our tax multiplier today, so we have all our multipliers so you can cover everything that we need to do. Now, if we have this situation right here, first we need to assess is what type of situation we're in. And this brings me back, a little side note here. When we did our Minecraft activity, a lot of you wanted to decrease aggregate demand. So you started off here, let's call this A1, and then you move this one to A2 over here to show it. Now, you're correct in showing the recession, but how we got there, I don't know what the situation is. It could have been aggregate supply decreased, okay? If they don't tell you and they say it's a recession or they say it's an inflation, just draw the gap and don't show the shifting how we got there, because I don't know what caused this situation. All I know, this is the situation we're starting from and we have to fix it from here, okay? So if they don't give you the pretext of what moved this into this recession, don't go and changing it to get there. And that's one thing I wanted to point out on our little quiz that we had on our long run aggregate supply. A lot of people, inflationary increased aggregate demand to get there. That might not have happened. It could have been aggregate supply increase. You don't know. Since you don't know, don't draw it. It's best just to start from the situation it says. Okay. Now, as we'll see as our FRQ at the end of here, it tells you what causes a recession. And at that point, you can show the shift because it specifically tells you this is what caused the recession that we're in. Okay. So this type of gap here is a recession, of course. And our type of policy would be best is expansionary, which is what we're meant due to spending. We should increase spending. And how much should we spend in this particular case? Now, this is the one thing we left off on Friday, and that was that if we need 100 billion here total, what you should not do is spend 100 billion, because what you're going to do is shoot us way over here. And this is why it's important to know our multipliers, because what you'll be doing is you'll constantly be bouncing us from a recession to inflation to recession to inflation, because there's only one value that's going to make this work, and there's an infinite number of values where that doesn't work. And it's much easier to hit an infinite number than it is to hit one value, right? So that's why it's important that we know our multipliers as we go through. Okay. Okay. So that was the spending multiplier. Now let's look at the tax multiplier over here. So that's the spending, this is the tax. Okay, very similar to that one here, but what we do is we take our MPC over our MPS. Okay, and notice it's negative. Okay, because usually we cut taxes in this one. Now it's going to be in relation here. Let's always do this here so we can understand. Okay, so we can see what happens. Let's say we'll put it right here. Let's draw a line here. And we'll call this my MPC. Here's all my possible values of my MPC. 0.90, 0.80. Oops, not 88. 0.80. 0.75. 0.66. 0.60. 0.50. And 0 is possible, although it's not going to happen a whole lot, okay? Now, we've already done this one. I went through the values. I think I gave you guys the accuracy one here. If we just plugged in 1 over the MPS, so if my 90, that means my MPS is 0.1, right? 1 over 0.1, my value is 10. 10 here, 5, 4, 3, 2.5, 2, and 1. Okay, that's how we get these values over here. So if I drew the line, these ones would all line up right across. And I'm just using my formula to solve. So 1 over 0.25, 1 over 25% is 4, 1 over 10% is 10, 1 over 50% is, oh, excuse me, I'm screwed up here. 1 over 10% is 10, 1 over 20% is 5, 1 over 25% is 4, 1 over 0.33 to the infinite is 3, and so forth. You get the idea. Those ones we already covered. So these are the only possible values you're going to ever get for your multipliers, okay? Nothing else is ever going to happen. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Those 7 is the highest possibility you get. You can't do anything else because you don't get a calculator and you'll get some weird spending multiplier. If we do the tax, so we're just going to plug it in the same values here. So now we put 0.90 over 0.10, right? That's going to give me a -9. Take the next one. 0.80 over 0.20, that's going to give me a -4. 0.75 over 0.25, that gives me a -3. And at this point, you should already see the pattern that's happening. I don't need to do any more. Is 0. Okay. The tax multiplier using the same marginal propensity to consume is always 1 less than the spending multiplier. If your spending multiplier is 10, your tax multiplier has got to be 9, and just make sure instead of +9, it's -9. Okay, because the reason is for them to work the same, it has to be the opposite. So this one is you cut taxes, this one is you increase spending. And we can flip this too. If you want to decrease spending, this becomes negative, but then your tax needs to be positive. And we'll see how that works during the whole course here. Okay, but you get this idea. It's always going to be 1 less than the spending multiplier. So the spending multiplier is much more effective for us than the tax multiplier. Okay. But we need both in order to solve these different problems now that we get up, because sometimes they'll say do the tax, sometimes they'll say do the spending. Can we calculate what's going to happen with each one? We totally can now using these two formulas. So if you don't, make sure you got this one written somewhere and make sure you got this one written somewhere, because these are the only two formulas we're going to use. Okay. Now this one you'll use for almost everything with the exception of when it says a tax, then we jump to this one. Okay. And I still like to calculate this one first because then what I can do is just take 1 less and get the tax multiplier. But these are going to be the only 7 values you get. You're not going to get anything else besides this one. And all the tests I've seen, it's only been these values right here. And that's because that's the only ones they expect you to calculate without a calculator. It's easy to figure these ones out. Anything else gets way too hard to calculate without a calculator. So they're not going to give it to you. So that's nice. You should always be somewhere in these range. So if you find your multiplier to be one of these values, chances are you did something correct, okay? If you're getting an ugly multiplier, it means you did something wrong and go back to start to fix it. Any questions on this now? Now we're going to go and show everything how it applies here. Our problem here. Okay. So Congress uses discretionary fiscal policy. It tells me my MPC is 0.8. Here's what the graph looks like. We need to answer some questions. We can answer all of these now as we go forth. Okay, let's talk about these ones as we go through it. First one, what type of gap do we have? That's easy. That's a recessionary gap. Okay, how do we fix this? Do we need contraction or expansionary? We need expansionary because that means increase AD, right? What are our two options? Well, we can cut taxes or we can increase government spending. Okay, how much initial government spending is needed to close the gap? Well, let's do both here. So first we'll do government spending right here, and then we'll do the taxes one over here. Okay, and since I know my MPC is 0.8, I know my MPS is 0.2. Okay. I know my formula for this one is 1 over the MPS, which is 1 over 0.2, which means my multiplier is 5. Okay, so how much are we short? Well, over here, we are short 500. So whatever this government spending I decide to do, I got to keep into account of my multiplier, which is 5. So 5 times whatever I do with the spending. And the highest outcome I want is a change of 500 in my AD or GDP. Solve for X. This particular problem would be 100. So the government needs to spend $100 to fix this, or I should say 100 billion. $100 billion to fix this problem. Okay. Now I didn't ask for it, but let's do taxes anyways here because we got it. So that would be 1 over the negative MPC over MPS. If I plugged in those values, I'd get negative 0.8 divided by negative 0.2. And that leaves me with a negative 4. Okay. Using the same process here, 4 times x equals 500. Solve for x. X is going to equal negative 125. So here's why you can see it. The government would need to cut, that's why it's negative, 125 billion, or increase its spending by 100 billion. Okay. And we can take this and combine them both. So what if they do half and half? Well, we'll get to those processes here. But using all or nothing, you can see. And that leads us to another important thing. Notice your tax one is always going to be less effective than your spending one. So it takes an extra 25 billion to get the same effect in the tax one as it does in the government spending. Why is that? Well, if I'm the government, I can spend the whole 100 if I want to, right? I can control my spending. But if I send you back that 100, let's say, of that 100, you may choose to save 80% of it and only spend 20. That's why that MPC comes important here. So I can spend all of it as the government, but when I send you back that same value, I got to apply that whatever the MPC, MPS value is to figure out what's going to happen. And that's why it's always going to be less. Your tax multiplier will always be slightly less than your government spending multiplier. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. You guys got the next one here real quick. I already got that answer. Thank you.